This podcast is being given as a repeat of the original presentation, which was given on June 5th, 2017, at Ridgeview Mennonite Church in Gordonville, Pennsylvania. This talk was part of the What Young Historians Are Thinking conference and is titled Mapping Piecework, 100 Years of Afsc Service at Home and Abroad. This talk is given by Stephen Bauman at Temple University. When we consider mapping piecework and what kinds of piecework have been done, the historian already has an enormous amount of material to choose from. I chose the American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC, because of both a couple reasons. One, because of the fact that it was their 100th anniversary, and it made sense to have a historian look into this 100th anniversary. We tend to like these sort of remembrance days. And also because I've studied the American Friends Service Committee before, and they've done some really incredible stuff. So, for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about the work that they have done over 100 years. Now, my goal was to trace the location and the connections between the operations in Philadelphia and the work done across the world. And from that, I formulated this argument that while the AFSC is a truly global, non-governmental organization that transcends national boundaries long before it's standard practice for NGOs to do transnational work, it still followed a pattern of service that's only comprehensible through this analysis of local political interactions. So that's what gives you the true insight to the AFSC. So first we have to define piecework. Now, piecework it understands peace, as this paper anyway, as an active action, like peace building, conflict resolution, state building, in which the idea of peace does not stop at the cessation of violence, but instead continues until the root causes of conflict are addressed. So this includes nearly all types of inequalities, from economic, social, etc. Now, my sources on this are from the American Friends Service Committee, their annual reviews that are published every year since 1917, a yearly review that shows service, a message from the leader of the organization, a financial table. Now, these are self-reported, so sometimes it's a little promotional. Maybe they're not the most unbiased, impartial evidence, but they are evidence nonetheless. So in some cases, it's a bit surprising. So in the case of Mexico, it's not mentioned in a lot of the promotional materials until suddenly it's the 25th anniversary of the AFSC in Mexico. And in other cases, like the Copenhagen Friends Service Center, it's mentioned in one or two pamphlets only briefly and never mentioned again. So you kind of wonder, like, what happened to the AFSC in Copenhagen after 1959. In order to correct for any inconsistencies in this source base, I tried to corroborate evidence. One example being Clarence Pickett, who was once the leader of the AFSC. He wrote a book called For More Than Bread, which accounts for his long career in the AFSC. And he talks about different events that may or may not be in those annual reviews. Another issue is the international scope of the work. So while the Friends are writing about, say, a place like Cuba, they are giving their perspective on Cuba, whereas Cubans and the nation itself might have not even put these Friends on the radar, because a lot of times these are small operations. So there's a lack of opportunity to corroborate evidence in that case, and that makes it a little bit tricky. Now, one of the important things that came right to the forefront was these foundational outposts, Quaker centers. And Quaker centers the idea was you're going to put a Quaker embassy in different places, and these kind of emerged and faded in cities like Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Amsterdam, Shanghai, Delhi, Tokyo, Geneva, Copenhagen. And what happens is the AFSC is there for a long time. They start doing grassroots organizing, and they have a lot of people from these countries who may or may not be friends. And this is where the work sort of starts, and it shoots out from these centers. Now, one of these great examples is in Clarence Pickett's memoir. He says, of the Berlin Center, "I remember sitting in a Quaker meeting one Sunday morning in our center on Prinz Louis Ferdinand Strasse, and listening to the screaming voice of Goebbels from a loudspeaker outside, pouring forth a venomous attack on all Jews, and calling upon the churches to have nothing to do with them. It was difficult to fix our minds on the eternal verities as we sat in worship with these screams dining into our ears. To hear the still small voice in the midst of the human thunder is an art of the prophets which requires cultivation." Of course, he's talking about the Quakers sitting in silence, waiting for the light to move them to speak. But we finally did become more deeply conscious of the very great need to find practical ways of expressing our belief in the value of human beings, no matter who they were or in what circumstance. This included concern for the bitter spirit of our prosecutors. Had not John Woolman been concerned for the slave owner as well as the slave? So this Berlin Center is this place where it's in the center of conflict. It had a history of the Quaker feedings after World War I, where the Quakers help Germans who need food, and it goes all the way to this part in World War II where there's an enormous amount of conflict, and the Quakers are standing amidst the conflict, trying to be problem solvers. Now, the change over time in the 100 years of the annual reports, you see a change from these Quaker centers. They start to turn into social media. So now Quakers are no longer necessarily on the ground making these relationships emanating out. Rather, they're using things like Twitter, Facebook to get out messages that they deem important. Now, another issue is the issue of committees. So committees are a foundational sort of Quaker phenomena where that's how things are organized. So different committees emerge. In the early times, you have things like the Friends Ambulance Unit, which is basically a delivery system in World War II. You have the Cuban Friends Service Committee, things that have to be incorporated under national laws and sort of form their own national system. Later on, the committees start to disappear. As we get towards the more modern era of the AFSC, you start to see issues. So we see a transition from committees to issues. The key issues, for example, ending discrimination, defending immigrant rights, building peace. These are the key issues of the modern time. And lastly, before I get to the actual data of the maps, the people of the AFSC, who were the American Friends Service Committee, we know there's not a huge amount of friends globally, so the AFSC has to draw on a variety of backgrounds. So although friends by name, the AFSC has not always been Quakers. And take the work during the Spanish Civil War, you have AFSC members served by the committee in Spain. Representatives were from the Church of the Brethren, the Mennonite Church, the American Unitarian Organization. There were British friends from the Friends Service Council. So it's sort of this dynamic union of anti-war activists that puts together this AFSC peace work. Even today, the AFSC is active in Indonesia, and rather than sending Quakers over to Indonesia, they're working with things like the Muslim Council, the local Muslim Council, the local Catholic organizations, and the governmental Ministry of Religious Affairs. So the people of the AFSC are always changing, which makes sort of a total history of the AFSC hard to write. Now, not that it hasn't been done. Being that this was the 100th anniversary, Gregory Barnes, a a professor, wrote a centennial history of the AFSC. So histories have been written of the American Friends Service Committee, but there remains an enormous amount of personal transnational interactions that have yet to be mined by historians and really understood for their true value. Now, over the 100 years, I immediately saw three distinct periods. That's immediately after I painstakingly read through each of the 100 annual reports. The way I saw it, between 1917 and 1945 was a foundational period. It was the World Wars. It was the response to the World Wars. You had this conflict in Europe, conflict in the Middle East, clearly defined conflicts in parts of the world that American Quakers might understand. After that, 1946 to 1989 is the reactionary period, I say, which is the Cold War, Africa and Latin America. In a lot of ways, the AFSC is following the footsteps of the empire. They're following the United States wherever the United States goes. So the United States fights a war in Vietnam. You can bet the AFSC was active in Vietnam. The United States has interest in Nicaragua. You can bet the AFSC is in Nicaragua. So that's the reactionary period. It's almost identical reactions to where the U.S. was versus, say, the foundational period where the AFSC might suggest work in Russia and the U.S. not have interest there. This is pre-Soviet Union. And the last period is the modernity period, 1990 to present. It's recent history. It's following news and nation. They're looking for stories in which they can get people interested, get active participation, and not necessarily focused on where the United States is or where a war is being fought. It's much more in line with what's being reported in popular media. So let's look at each of these three. First, the foundational period. The AFSC is founded April 30th, 1917, to develop a service that's best delivered by the Society of Friends. These are their words, due to its heritage and faith. The first call was in the rubble of World War I, feeding the hungry. This meant the fields of Evras or the tubercular settlement of Malabry near the Marne in Chalon. Hundreds of houses were built from the ruins of war. These were friends who had carpentry skills, who were going straight to the battlefields in France, rebuilding houses. On the other side of Europe, north of the Caspian Sea, the AFSC is doing the same thing in Russia. It's unclear why cities were chosen, certain cities were chosen, and it was not always Americans who were doing AFSC work. For example, there was an expedition led by a Glaswegian writer, Robert Tatlock, out in the middle of Russia. That's one of those situations that's just calling for future research. It's interesting, right? Why is a Scottish man working for an American NGO trying to solve a problem in Russia? And people are paying for this. And nearby meetings and Mennonite and Brethren churches are picking up the tab for this kind of work. This is a very powerful sort of fundraising is starting to happen. Throughout World War I, the AFSC has an undoubtedly Christian identity. It claims, we propose to continue to make this peace work a practical demonstration of Christianity. The spirit of love which is revealed in Jesus represents the only way to prevent war and its attendant sufferings. This is something that really changes as we go on. And if you look at the map of the places they worked in that first period, everything's above the equator. Everything's in what would be the global north, or what we consider the global north today, and in places that you might expect Quakers to have relationships. Now, in the reactionary period, that's the second period, there's a clear movement away from Europe. In this period, they go to South America, Africa, in greater numbers, Central America, yet it's still largely defined by this split between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's very much a part of the Cold War split. So in 1947, the AFSC wins the Nobel Peace Prize for its award It's award-winning work in World War II. In the acceptance speech, Clarence Pickett mentions the AFSC wants to reach out across this iron curtain to the Soviet Union, and in the next week he's met by a representative from the Soviet Amtorg Trading Corporation who said, "We'll gladly accept your money, but you're not coming to the Soviet Union." So the AFSC still wants to continue these relationships, and they indeed do, despite the terms not being something that maybe, say, the government of the United States would accept. So that's where the sort of power of being an NGO comes in, where the AFSC is willing to say, okay, we do trust you, Soviet Union. We're going to give you $25,000 to help distribute money and food in these areas. Another major event is the transition to independence for most of Africa. The AFSC and Quakers do have roots in Africa. In fact, most Quakers today are in Africa, in countries like Kenya. So the AFSC was in a reaction both to the growing polarity of the civil rights movement in the United States and reaching out to Africa, and also because there were foundational settings for Quakers there. You know, almost 30 years after World War II, the AFSC follows or goes just before the United States military in many different instances. In the case of Vietnam, in the case of Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, all these places the United States has interactions with, and the AFSC either follows or goes directly before when there's a revolution. That's how it works for what I deem the second of 3 parts of the AFSC. And you can see an expansion to the global south and beyond. Today, the AFSC has left much of its Christian identity in favor of more generic spirituality. Today it's self-described as promoting lasting peace, with justice as an expression of faith in action, drawing on continuing spiritual insights, and working with people from many backgrounds. The AFSC says they nurture the seeds of change and respect for human life that transform social relations and systems. And one example is their Courageous Acts program. This is the new program after the 100th anniversary. It raised $40 million and began with an expansion of the Youth Undoing Institutional Racism campaign program in the United States. Now, this is a distinctly different campaign than the kind that would have been run 100 years ago. Although the AFSC was active in the United States, especially in coal country West Virginia, working with unions, a little different than the institutional racism project they're working on now, and it sort of shows a shift. The AFSC getting more local, getting more broadly spiritual rather than strictly Christian, and it's led to a fair amount of conflict within the organization. Ultimately, when we look at all these places that the AFSC has served in 100 years, it's astounding. They've gone to so many countries in 100 years, and they've helped so many individuals, so many people, without any motive behind it but simply to help people. And this alone should be applauded. With that said, we can learn an enormous amount about NGOs, the way religious organizations work, and a ton of other information by looking at each of these situations where the AFSC has worked. Interestingly, the AFSC in English literature has not seen a continuous increase in profile, despite the fact that fundraising has gone up. It's made more money each year, made more money being total donations have been more each year since 1917, without a doubt. Yet, mentions in English literature seem to peak around the 1970s, the civil rights movement, and maybe Vietnam, and then they take a sharp decline straight through the 80s, the 90s, and thousands, and continues to be down, which perplexingly, if you look at NGOs in English literature, and these are Google engrams that I'm looking at, the AFSC was mentioned far more than things like Oxfam and Amnesty International all through the 1960s, long after the AFSC was founded, the recent foundation of Oxfam and Amnesty. But in the mid-1970s, Amnesty takes off. In the 1980s, Oxfam takes off. And these are both NGOs that are non-religious and one issue. They start as one issue. Amnesty starts with prisons. Oxfam starts with famine. And they get an enormous following. Both of those are continuing to rise and being mentioned off the charts, continuing to grow, whereas the AFSC seems to have a decline. So these are all data that certainly merit more discussion. They're not conclusive in the least, but they're starting points for an enormous amount of studies. One potential area of further research is matching up the United States military excursions and the AFSC efforts for peace work. Does peace work have to be paired with the leading government's military endeavors? So do the AFSC, because they're the American Friends Service Committee, do they have to follow the footsteps of the American military? It certainly seems that way from the data, but that's a question to ask in the future. And you can see in the maps that I've put on Google Fusion tables, paired up, it's almost astonishing. The areas of the world that haven't been touched by either military or AFSC haven't been touched by either. There's very few countries that have been touched by one of these operations and not the other. What remains are hundreds of unexplored historical gems. Not only does this research offer insight into the way in which organizations with interests perpendicular or unrelated to government interests operated, but it also presents an opportunity to understand how people make connections that go beyond national, linguistic, social boundaries in order to advance moral and ethical goals. Indeed, it's not an easy task to advance moral and ethical goals, and it is my hypothesis that future research will show a combination of shrewd political operations both at home and abroad, healthy economic foundations at home certainly and potentially abroad, and transnational personal relationships that are the basis of any successful non-governmental operation. As far as the AFSC is concerned, enormous questions should be raised on the relevance of these non-governmental organizations or the search for relevance by the organizations themselves. The question of division within ever smaller religious groups. There are fewer and fewer Quakers today. It's not an organization that's growing, and there's stark divisions between the different meetings of Quakers, and some that edge closer to Christianity, whereas others are more towards a Unitarian Universalist spirituality. Latin America continues to be an enormous issue, as that's where a lot of growth is, yet the relations between the United States and Latin America are still not what they might be. Africa, with its enormous population growth and its huge amount of friends, 1/3 of the world's Quakers are in Africa. So what sort of changes would that mean for the AFSC? And generally the future direction of the American Friends Service Committee. Whereas someone who was against war in World War I would become a conscientious objector, refuse to fight in the military, and the AFSC would provide an outlet to do service in the same theater of war. A person now who's a conscientious objector is not obliged to sign up for the military, well, maybe through selective service, but not join the military, leading a lack of necessity to join a group like the AFSC. Indeed, if a person even went to a university wanting to work for the American Friends Service Committee, they might be very disappointed to find only non-paid internships and certain particular qualities that the AFSC is looking for that are not available for joining. It becomes a much more selective organization rather than a voluntary organization for those who have no other choice. Whatever your opinion on the matter, we can agree on one thing. The American Friends Service Committee has an enormous amount of material for us to delve into, to talk about. They've done amazing work. There are people who remember the impact they made on their community. There are people who remember that black and red Quaker star in times of war as a sign of peace. And that alone makes this organization worth studying. Yet, there are a lot of questions we still have to answer. Thank you very much for this talk, and feel free to email me or send me any questions you have about this topic.